If you think the truth always comes to light, you've never heard this one. Subscribe, and let's begin. The murder that solved a missing person case 10 years later. They arrived to a quiet street pretending to be ordinary, maple trees throwing long shadows across neat lawns, sprinklers hissing like distant whispers, a mailbox still half full. By the time the patrol cars swallowed the curb and the coroner's van backed in, dusk had pulled a cool blue sheet over the neighborhood. Yellow tape fluttered, a small flag planted against the manicured "Come, do not cross." Inside number 23, the house smelled of lemon hand soap and stale coffee. It smelled like someone who still made their bed on purpose, like a life interrupted. The living room light was on, a lamp left burning as if someone had planned to come back. Photos sat on the mantel, Renee in a nursing badge, smiling at a graduation cap, Renee with a bright hospital bracelet in a sunlit garden, Renee and a man, Michael, at a county fair, both younger, both laughing into a camera that no one would ever look through again without a sharp intake of air. Detective Jasmine Archer moved through the house the way a surgeon reads an old scar. Her flashlight traced a pattern across the floorboards, over the overturned vase, past the chair with the fallen scarf, finally resting on the small, round dining table where a cup still trembled from being set down in a hurry. She noticed details the cameras would miss, the cigarette butt in the ashtray on the back porch, out of place for a woman who preached health to her students, and the faint smear at the threshold where someone had wiped at their feet, perhaps in a hurry, perhaps trying to erase a footprint. Renee Pagel had been a nurse instructor, 36, known for a steady hand and a surprising streak of warmth. Just days before, she had walked into a hospital and offered a kidney to the stranger's father, a quiet, selfless act that made the local news. That generosity became the first thing people said when they tried to reconcile how someone could be savagely killed in her home. It did not make sense. It made the loss hurt more. The official count, more than 50 stab wounds, was carried in the coroner's report like a cold fact. Detective Archer read it 3 times and felt only the blank wall of what that meant. They would not dwell on the image, they would catalog, collect, note. For the cameras they would say, brutal. For themselves, they said nothing. They worked. Michael Pagel sat on the curb outside, cigarette gone from his hand, eyes hollows of something the neighbors called broken. The divorce had been public, their fights had threaded the community grapevine, lawyers' names whispered behind mailboxes. But observation and whispers are not evidence. The first days were full of accusations, heated questions on porches and in echoing police stations, but Detective Archer had learned the hard discipline of separating heat from proof. They had to prove it, not feel it. Inside, technicians bagged bedding, dusted the windows, photographed every angle until the living room looked like an art installation of crime scene documentation. A forensics tech in a Tyvek suit crouched by the hearth and, with the gentleness of someone removing an insect from a delicate plant, pried up a loose floorboard. Nothing about this house was new, it had the creaks of age and the many, invisible repairs homeowners make to keep appearances. The board lifted with a sigh, and beneath it lay a narrow cavity, the kind of place a homeowner might hide a spare key or a shoehorn. They were looking for a weapon. They were looking for fingerprints, fibers, anything that could pin a moment of violence to a person. The slot under the floor yielded a small, folded piece of paper, a shopping list, nothing more, and then, inexplicably, the brim of a baseball cap, yellowed and stiff with dust. It was a child's cap, once bright, now soft with age. Someone on the team called it out as if reading a line in a book. The name stitched along the inside sweatband had been washed nearly clean, but a sharp-eyed technician read the faded letters and froze, D. Miller. Detective Archer felt a cold offset the summer air. D. Miller. That name had a weight. 10 years earlier, a boy named Danny Miller had vanished from a nearby playground on a July afternoon. The case had hollowed a town, posters had turned brittle and yellow on telephone poles, volunteers had combed woods until their boots were raw, and police had followed trail after trail until the trails ran dry. The community had replaced hope with ritual, leaving an extra light on at night, checking car seats twice, scanning the edges of forests out of habit. No arrest had been made. No remains had ever been found. The cap should not have been in Renee's house. It did not belong to her. It did not belong to Michael. It belonged to a missing boy who had been someone else's son, someone else's laughter. When they photographed the cap, the camera caught a smudge along the brim, likely mud from a playground, possibly a leaf imprint. A lab tech remarked offhandedly that the stitch pattern was unique, a brand sold at a single sporting shop down on Main Street. Michael, sitting outside, ran his hand over his stubbled jaw and muttered to himself. He was still in the frame for the press, he would be for a long time. In the meantime, a cap with the name D. Miller sat in an evidence bag and breathed new oxygen into a case that had been quiet for a decade. Word traveled fast, a connection between Renee's death and an old missing person case. Reporters arrived in vans like migrating birds, their microphones outstretched. Neighbors peered from curtains. Rumors began to coil. Was Danny Miller's cap a planted clue? A coincidence? A grim breadcrumb left by a killer with a taste for cruelty, or a coincidence that made everything look like intent? Detective Archer did not make the leap. She logged the item, took swabs, and asked the lab to pull anything they could from the fabric, fibers, hairs, the faint saline residue of a decade. She ordered the old missing person file to be reopened in the cold light of new evidence. She instructed officers to re-interview the Miller family, a call she knew would reopen a grief that had calcified into a community scar. Sitting behind the wheel of her car that night, Archer thought of Renee's kidney donation, how altruism and tragedy sometimes sit too close together. She thought of the messages left on voicemail, angry, pleading, banal, that now scanned like static for meaning. The house had been staged to look unremarkable, little gave away where the violence had come from. And yet, beneath the floorboards, a child's cap suggested a history that refused to stay buried. Then, as the team closed up for the night, the evidence tech, a quiet man named Lopez who had worked the same beat for 15 years, held up a small piece of paper recovered from the living room phone cradle. It was a printout from Renee's cordless handset, a single missed call, logged and yellowed. The timestamp read August 12, 2006, 2 hours before the estimated time of death. The number was unlisted. When Lopez punched the digits into a detective's database, the number did not immediately resolve. Archer felt the room tilt forward, the way a theater stage does when the trapdoor opens. Someone had called Renee that night. Whoever it was had an unlisted number and had left no message. The log was a dry thing, a tiny timestamp, but it sat like an accusation. Archer thought of the cap, of a boy who had vanished, and of a woman who had given a piece of herself to a stranger days before. She thought of how cases fold into one another across years, how an old grief can take a new shape. Outside, Michael looked up as if he could sense the shift. He had answers in his hands, he said, and he had nothing. The neighborhood had its verdict already. But Archer had read enough to know that verdicts were not proof. The cap under the floorboard and the unlisted number in the cradle were threads. Pull one, and the rest of the weave might come apart. She ordered the number traced. She ordered the Miller file dusted off and the team to reopen interviews with anyone who had last seen Danny. She ordered everything that could be ordered because it was all she could do. They boxed the cap and loaded it into evidence, the same way they boxed photographs and meals and the brittle little reliquaries of ordinary lives. The bag would go to a lab, and the lab would whisper back in results and analogies and DNA sequences. But the lab could not explain motive, could not tell them why a bright, living woman would be killed in her own home after an act of generosity, nor why a missing child cap would find its way into her floor. As the house lights went out one by one, Detective Archer walked back to her car and found a slip of paper tucked under her windshield wiper, likely left by a journalist. On it, in hurried writing, someone had scrawled, "Why Danny?" It was the question that would not leave the town, the question that would pivot a murder into an investigation that reached back 10 years. Archer folded the paper, placed it in her pocket, and sat for a moment in the dark. The street was quiet again, but the quiet felt fragile. The discovery under the floorboards had changed the case from a single, private tragedy into something that tugged at the whole town's past. A missing boy. A woman who gave a kidney. A divorce that had turned bitter. A phone number with no name. And then Lopez, from the back of the van, called out in a voice that had no business being hopeful, "You'll want to hear this, the lab just pinged the storage database. That cap's been in evidence before." He looked at Archer, and the word that followed hovered in the warm air like the first note of a violin, from the Danny Miller file. They had expected to find a weapon. They had expected to find prints. They had not expected the house to hand them the ghost of another case. The two files were no longer separate. They were entangled. Outside, the neighborhood held its breath. Inside, Detective Archer felt the pull of a story unfurling back toward a child who had been lost, and toward a truth that would not be satisfied by the simple answers the town wanted. She did not know yet whether this was the lead that would finally bring a family some sort of closure, or whether it was the beginning of a crueler unraveling. But one fact had hardened: the murder was not just a blot on one life. It had become a lever that could pry open a decade-old silence. And somewhere, someone who had kept a secret for 10 years, someone who had possessions, keys, and perhaps a conscience still working quietly under the weight of time, might finally be counting the cost of that silence. The spiral. By morning, the house was no longer a crime scene, it was a landmark. Reporters had camped along the curb, microphones poised toward the front door, their voices cutting through the Michigan humidity like static. A brutal murder, new evidence, a connection to a missing child. Detective Jasmine Archer watched from across the street, coffee cooling in her hand. She knew the pattern: a burst of headlines, speculation, then silence when the truth refused to move fast enough. But this time, the silence wouldn't last. The lab's first report came in just before noon. The DNA on the brim of the cap didn't match Renee, or Michael Pagel, or anyone in the household. It matched unknown male, mid-30s, probable Caucasian origin. The same partial profile had appeared once before, in a swab taken from the handlebars of Danny Miller's abandoned bike 10 years earlier. That couldn't be a coincidence. The Miller family lived 2 towns over, in a modest house with wind chimes that never seemed to stop moving. When Archer arrived, Danny's mother, Claire Miller, looked older than her years. Grief had etched her in quiet ways. She led Archer to the living room, where a shelf still displayed Danny's baseball trophies and a school photo, laminated and fading. "I told them it wasn't random," Claire said, her voice steady. "Danny didn't just disappear. Someone took him. Someone who knew us." Archer listened. She had learned that grief often spoke in circles before it landed anywhere near truth. But something in Claire's tone cut deeper, not hysteria, but memory. She pulled a box from the coffee table. Inside were old flyers, letters, and one photo Archer hadn't seen before: Danny, maybe 7, smiling beside a man with a clipboard at a community fair. The man's face was mostly hidden, but the tag on his shirt was clear enough: Pagel Home Improvement. Michael Pagel. That night, Archer sat alone in the precinct's evidence room, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled Renee Pagel homicide and Danny Miller disappearance. 2 cases, 10 years apart, now tethered by a child's cap and a company name. She replayed Michael Pagel's initial interview. The audio hissed with room noise and his low, even voice. "We were arguing about custody," he'd said. "She wanted full. I wanted fair. But I'd never hurt her." In the recording, he sounded exhausted, not angry. But exhaustion can hide a lot: guilt, fear, or something worse. She checked the new phone record analysis. The unlisted number that called Renee's house before her murder was traced to a prepaid burner phone, purchased in 2015, reactivated only once, the night she died. And the buyer's ID used at the store? Fake. But the security footage showed a man in a dark ball cap with a home repair company logo. Grainy, but unmistakable. The same logo Claire Miller had kept in that photo. A storm rolled through that night, rain slicking the roads, thunder crawling across the horizon. Archer drove back to the Pageau residence under flashing streetlights. Michael answered the door in a wrinkled shirt, surprise melting into defensiveness the second he saw her badge. "I already talked to you people," he said, jaw tight. "This isn't about Renee," Archer replied. "It's about a boy named Danny Miller." The name froze him. A beat of silence, then he exhaled, sharp, practiced. "I don't know any Danny Miller." But his eyes betrayed him. Archer had seen the same look before, a flicker, quick and fearful, like the mind flipping through old film reels it had tried to burn. "We found his cap in Renee's floorboards," she said. "With DNA that connects both scenes." Michael's hands twitched at his sides. "That's impossible." "Maybe," Archer said quietly. "Unless someone kept a souvenir." Back at the precinct, they re-interviewed everyone tied to Michael's company. One name came up, Mark Lacey, a subcontractor who'd done part-time work for him around 2006. Lacey had vanished not long after Danny's disappearance. No forwarding address, no social security filings, no tax records since 2007. A ghost. Until now. A database search revealed a recent DMV update under a new alias in northern Michigan, a man living under the name Ethan Laird, working maintenance at a lakeside camp for underprivileged kids. A man in his mid-40s. A man who matched the description of the figure in the store surveillance video buying that burner phone. The drive north took 4 hours. Pines closed in on the road as Archer approached the camp, cabins dark, wind rippling the lake like broken glass. She found him near the dock, repairing a canoe with a toolbox at his feet. "Ethan Laird," she called out. He turned. The flashlight caught his face, wary, pale, his expression neither surprise nor recognition. "Depends who's asking." "Detective Archer. Grand Rapids Police." He nodded once, slow. "This about the kids?" "I got all my licenses." "It's about a boy," she said. "One who didn't make it home." Something shifted in his posture. The wrench in his hand stopped moving. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," she said, stepping closer. "You worked for Michael Pageau. You disappeared after a child did. Then, 10 years later, a woman connected to him is murdered, and the DNA from that child's cap shows up in her house. How does that happen, Ethan?" His breath hitched. The rain started again, soft, steady. For a moment, the only sound was water on the dock. Then he said, quietly, "You don't understand. She wasn't supposed to find it." Back at headquarters, Archer replayed the audio recording from her hidden mic, over and over. She wasn't supposed to find it. Not him. Not the boy. It. Something physical. Something hidden, maybe inside Renee's house, maybe left behind from that summer in 2006. She ordered a full second sweep of the Pageau residence. Beneath the basement stairs, in a patch of concrete that looked newer than the rest, the forensic team drilled a small core sample. It was hollow underneath. As the bit broke through the thin layer, a metallic sound rang out, the unmistakable clink of steel striking metal. Inside the cavity lay a rusted lockbox. When they pried it open, dust and air escaped like a sigh from another decade. Inside, a single Polaroid, faded but clear enough to freeze everyone in the room. It was Renee, standing beside a small boy with sandy hair. Danny Miller. Both smiling, both unaware that the picture would one day become evidence. And behind them, half in shadow, stood another figure. A man in work boots and a construction vest, his face only partly visible. Detective Archer's heart slowed. She recognized the jawline immediately. It wasn't Michael Pageau. It was Mark Lacey. But then she noticed something else, a hand on Renee's shoulder. A wedding band. One identical to the one Michael still wore the night she interviewed him. Renee had known something. And maybe, 10 years later, she tried to expose it. Archer closed the box, her reflection pale in the Polaroid's glassy surface. She wasn't supposed to find it, Lacey had said. Now she understood what it was, proof that tied the missing boy, the murder, and the Pagels together in one haunting frame. Outside, thunder rolled again, low and endless. Archer felt the spiral tighten, too many secrets collapsing into one truth no one wanted to face. And in that moment, her phone buzzed, a blocked number, the same area code as Renee's last call. She answered. A man's voice, low, almost calm. "Detective, stop digging. You have no idea what's buried." Then the line went dead. The reckoning. The voice on the phone lingered in Detective Jasmine Archer's head long after the call ended, calm, deliberate, chillingly certain. "You have no idea what's buried." By dawn, she'd already called in backup. The air outside the station was heavy with mist, the kind that swallowed sound and made everything feel just slightly unreal. Inside, the Polaroid from Renee's basement sat under a forensic light, its edges curling as if time itself wanted to hide it again. In the photo, Renee's smile was small, uneasy. Danny Miller's was wide, innocent. And the man in the background, Mark Lacey, stood at the edge of the frame like a shadow caught mid-step. But Archer couldn't shake the hand on Renee's shoulder. The wedding band gleamed faintly in the flash. Michael Pagel had been there that day. At 7 a.m., Archer and her team moved on a warrant. Lacey was taken into custody at the lakeside camp without a struggle, no words, no resistance, just quiet acceptance. When they brought him in, his first sentence wasn't a denial. "She was supposed to hand it over," he muttered. "Not open it." They recorded every word. In interrogation, Lacey's story unspooled like a confession rehearsed in nightmares. Back in 2006, Michael Pagel's home renovation business had been in trouble. Cash flow was low. Lacey, his right-hand man, took side jobs to keep them afloat. One of those side jobs came from a desperate father offering money to scare off another man rumored to be preying on kids in the neighborhood. But the plan went wrong. A confrontation turned violent. The boy, Danny Miller, had seen something he shouldn't have. Lacey's voice cracked. "Michael said we'd handle it. Said no one needed to know. They'd buried the evidence, not the boy, at least, that's what Lacey insisted. Danny had disappeared, yes, but they hadn't killed him. Michael told me the kid was safe," he said. Said he'd sent him away with an uncle. But when Renee found the Polaroid, proof that connected her husband's business to the missing boy, she confronted Michael. And that confrontation ended with her murder. 50 stab wounds, Archer said coldly. "That's not panic, that's rage." Lacey looked at her with hollow eyes. "You don't understand. Michael didn't do it himself." Meanwhile, officers executed a second warrant at Michael Pagel's property. In his garage, beneath a tarp, they found an old storage trunk, labeled with fading ink, "Summer '06, Tools and Supplies." Inside, among rusted nails and paint cans, was a child's backpack. The zipper was broken. The initials DM were stitched inside. And beneath it, wrapped in plastic, the long-missing murder weapon, a serrated kitchen knife, stained but still sharp. Forensics confirmed what Archer already knew, the blade matched the wounds on Renee Pagel's body. They had their weapon. But whose fingerprints were on it? The answer came 2 hours later, partial match to Mark Lacey. But over the prints, smeared faintly, Michael Pagel's DNA. Archer stared at the report. 2 men, bound by a crime 10 years old. 1 missing boy. 1 dead woman. 1 truth left to surface. When Archer entered the interrogation room again, Lacey was trembling. "You said Michael didn't kill her," Archer said. But the weapon says otherwise. Lacey's head dropped. He didn't swing it, detective. But he made sure she'd bleed. He described how Michael had called him the night Renee died, voice shaking, saying she'd found the photo, saying she was threatening to turn it in. He begged Lacey to take care of it. Lacey refused, until Michael reminded him of what they'd done 10 years ago, of the boy who vanished, of the deal that kept them both out of prison. I went there to scare her, Lacey said. She fought back. I panicked. When it was over, Michael showed up. He took the knife from me. Said he'd clean everything. Said we'd be even. Even. The word hung in the air like a sentence. By sunset, Archer had a search team digging behind an old property connected to Pagel Home Improvement. It was a disused site, once owned by the company, the same address that appeared in a 2006 invoice for repairs near the Miller's home. They found the boy's bicycle first, half rusted, tangled in roots. Nearby, shallow ground gave way beneath their shovels. Wrapped in plastic sheeting, skeletal remains surfaced under the beam of floodlights. The medical examiner confirmed it that night. Dental records matched Danny Miller. The missing person case was no longer missing. It was murder. And with it, Renee's death had its motive. She'd uncovered the proof that her husband had buried a child's death and built his life on the lie. Archer walked into Michael Pagel's home for the final time. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank wall. The morning paper lay open beside him, headline bold, "Missing Boy Found. 2 arrests expected." He didn't resist. Didn't even flinch when she read him his rights. "I suppose she finally won," he said softly. "She always needed to be right." Archer said nothing. She watched as he was led away, the same man who'd once smiled beside Renee in that fairground photo, now reduced to a hollow shape swallowed by blue light and camera flashes. Weeks later, the case files sat closed on Archer's desk. 2 names, 2 deaths, 1 truth that had taken a decade to claw its way to daylight. The public called Renee Pagel a hero again, but Archer knew the cost. Her act of kindness, that kidney donation, had been her way of atoning for a life she hadn't realized was built beside a monster. Before she left the office, Archer received one last call. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then, curiosity won. "Detective Archer," a woman's voice said. "This is Claire Miller. They said you found him." "My boy." Archer closed her eyes. "We did." "Thank you," Claire whispered. "You kept your promise." There was silence, then the line clicked dead. Archer looked at the photo on her desk, the Polaroid, now sealed in evidence. Renee. Danny. And that shadow in the background. Proof that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like family. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the last of autumn's leaves across the parking lot. For the first time in months, Archer felt the weight lift, but only slightly. Because one sentence from Lacey's confession still echoed in her mind. He said he'd cleaned everything. The police later confirmed every trace, every weapon, every connection. Everything, except one. The burner phone, the one that called Renee the night she died, was never found. And somewhere in Michigan, as the lake froze over for winter, a single phone rang in the dark, the same blocked number lighting up an unlisted line. If you think this story was intense, wait till you hear the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss it.